Leg injuries in general are up to about 70% of all gymnastics injuries based on what you look at, college or elite or club compulsory. 50% of all the injuries that happened across all the NCAA in those 5 years were leg, right? And the knee and the ankle is the most common. And then if you look at some studies, about half the injuries that are occurring in gymnastics are having something to do with landings. Landings are considered the riskiest exercise phase in all of gymnastics, right? So, okay, and the biggest factor these all have in common are landings. There's so many factors that go into why somebody gets an ACL tear or why somebody has a stress fracture. I'm not saying it's just landings, but a common denominator that's really obvious is that landings can affect all of these things: the knee, the ankle, the overuse stuff, the back, right? And if you look at the forces of gymnastics, the highest recorded forces we know are during landings, right? So they're anywhere between 5 to 18 times body weight, just like regular stuff. So that was a double back on floor on a force plate in a condition that they measured in the lab. The highest recorded forces anywhere are at the ankle joint, which is 23 times body weight during landing and tumbling, right? And so we want to make sure that the gymnasts aren't getting deducted if they're landing in what's considered the safest way as possible. And from the side, when you look at someone, you want to see that when they're landing, the hip angle is relatively open when they hit the ground. Well, the reason that is because if the hip joint is open, they can bend and absorb forces, right? When joints bend and you're using proper technique, things like the glutes, the hamstrings, the quads, they can help slow down some of those forces and dissipate those forces, right? So if we land with a hip angle that's open, right, it allows you to kind of land. I think if you don't have that hip angle to bend, there's really no way to help absorb the forces, okay? One of the biggest things we know from ACL research is that landing with a 30-degree angle in the knee is massively important. The reason that is because it allows the back and the front of the leg muscles to work equally. Okay, so the hamstrings and the quads work equally when you land at a 30-degree knee bend. What happens oftentimes, as we'll see in a video, is when you land very upright and the knees don't hit that 30-degree angle, it's what we call a quad dominant landing in rehab, right? And what that means is it's a lot of stress on the front of the knee, but it's very, very high chance for the knee joint to kind of cave and pivot. And that's how an ACL tear occurs, or a meniscus tear, or someone hyperextends their knee or something like that. So it's very important that when they are hitting the ground, we want to train and use and see that 30-degree landing, right, angle starting at a beginning point. 2 and 3 are probably the most important from a side view, okay? Number 3 is that the hip and the knee angles continue to bend until they reach a squat just above parallel, okay? So I don't believe in going really, really far past parallel because we know that's not optimal for the knee joint, but starting at 30 degrees and bending about 40 or 50 more degrees until you get to a squat to parallel is the best possible chance of using everything you have to slow down those forces, okay? So what happens when you squat to parallel is your glutes, your hamstrings, your quads, your calves, they are all very, very active to absorb those forces, right? So if you have an athlete that's very, very strong, they do all their physical preparation, and they're doing everything they can to get strong in the gym, but then they don't land in a way that allows the squat to go down to parallel, they're not using the strength they have to protect themselves. And what it puts a high amount of force on is the knee joints, right? So it's a lot of potential buckling of the knee or of the ankle joint, and then also the back can be jarred too as well. So we want to see somebody squat to parallel depth or just above, right? So about 80 degrees of parallel or so. Okay, and then when you look at someone from the side, we draw imaginary lines down their torso angle and down their shin angle. You see relatively parallel lines between their torso and their shin. So as they land, you want that to be more open of a hip angle, but then they want to find themselves in a slightly forward chest angle. And as they're squatting to depth, you want to see those lines be relatively parallel. But what we know is that when you squat in that way, we know that the muscle activity is really, really high in the back of the leg, the glutes, the hamstrings, the outer hips. That's just the way to get a nice proper squat that, again, shares the load across all the joints. So those are the 4 big things that we're looking for when we're seeing somebody. Are they squatting in a way that's maximally protecting them against the forces that they have coming their way? And I think a really good example of this is Kyla. I'll play it a couple times. And hopefully you guys can see similar things of what I just talked about in the beginning of the lecture. Just one more time here. Okay, so just look for squat depth, look for the way her chest angle is, right? And you see how she does have a really nice descent into the squat. So again, the reason we're trying to do that is because we want to see, can we absorb those forces maximally, right? So when you look at her from the side, the hip angle is relatively open at initial impact, right? And then she has that 30 degrees of knee bend. She's separating her legs and slightly bending her knees before impact to get ready for the landings versus trying to really have perfect form and having pin straight legs as she hits the ground. That's obviously going to be something that's a little bit higher risk. And you'll see this in the next slide as I broke it down, right? So as you look at the green angles, right? So that's going to be the hip and the knee bending through parallel. She has this open angle, and then you can see here as she goes farther and farther, the hip angle closes, the knee angle closes down to just above parallel, right? So this is what I would consider not something that's too far depth. Any more past this, I would say is, but she has almost a textbook shock absorption land in it. But this way of landing is how you have the best chance of sticking, because again, you're using all of the muscles you can to absorb the forces. If someone is not doing this, they're not bending their knees, they oftentimes lose balance and take a step or fall because there's no way for the force to go and they have to take a big step forward to recover. So what's not ideal, right? What do we, it's going to be the opposite of a lot of those things, right? So one is going to be the hip angle is more closed when they hit the ground, because again, we have less glute engagement and muscle to help. If we don't have that hip angle open, it's hard to absorb those forces with a bend. The knee angle is not bent to 30 degrees. It's under 30 degrees. Okay. That's the highest risk position for ACL. That's where a lot of ACL tears happen is under 30 degrees, because the hamstring is not really involved. The glute's not involved and the quads are taking a lot of stress. We don't see the hip and knee angles bend to squat to parallel, because again, all those muscles can't help to absorb the force. It's really a lot on the quad. And then the chest angle being very, very straight upright or very, very pitched forward to parallel, right? Parallel is clearly going to be something that's a deduction. That's going to be a lot of stress on the lower back, but having someone's very, very upright torso means the knees have to bend a lot more to take that stress, but the hip is not helping out. It's all knee in the landings, right? So you don't have those parallel lines. So, okay. So when you look from the front, the biggest thing we're going to look for is that when someone squats, the hip, the knee, the ankle are all in line. From a straight on point of view, if you land and the knees buckle in together, that's a lot of stress on the knee. That's how a lot of ACL tears occur. Okay. Also, if your feet and your knees are already close together, it's very hard to control the knees moving side to side because they're not really protected at all from the up top hip muscles. So when you land in a proper kind of train tracks analogy is what we tell kids, is the muscles on the outside of the hip are allowed to work really hard and prevent that kind of quiver or that knee buckling in. Sometimes you don't see this because it's so fast, but sometimes, unfortunately, it happens in a blink of an eye that somebody lands like this, their knees knock together, and then they land and they stick perfectly. You can see it like we call it a twitch, right? A very quick twitch in and out. And that's when a lot of these injuries can kind of happen. So we'd like to see the knees in feet hip width apart, but they remain parallel as they squat down into that depth, okay? The other really big thing we know from ACL research is obviously when you land, you want each leg to take about 50% of the weight. So if your chest is leaning towards one side and you're more centered over one leg, you might have, of the 18, forces of body weight, you might have half those forces not being on equal leg. It might be 12 times your body weight on one side and 6 on the other. I'm just making up numbers, but a lot more on one side. And obviously that's going to be something that might overload and cause some serious injuries if somebody has an issue with that. If they're off tilted. But one thing we want to teach athletes is to keep their torso directly over the midpoint of their body when they do land. Okay, well, let's look at Kyla, who has a really good front view here, right? So I'll play it one more time. Watch her left knee in particular. I think you can see that left leg start to wiggle in, and she's very strong. She keeps it again. And again, she got a 10 on this as well, right? So I'll play it one more time. Watch her when we break down this, we see those same things. The chest is equally over both knees as she squats, but the hips are relatively in line with the knees and the toes throughout the entire squat. And again, I picked this on purpose because you'll see this left leg kind of quiver and slow stills. Again, she has that open contact. Very, very important, right? She has to separate her legs in the air at the very end in order to be prepared for some of these landing forces, right? In the same way that she slightly bends her knees, she also slightly brings her legs apart. And that's necessary in order for her to land properly, okay? So as she hits initial impact from the side, you would see that 30-degree knee bend angle and that hip angle open. But as she sinks into her squat, there's not a lot of movement of here and here in her torso, right? You can see right here, that left leg starts to quiver in, but she can fire her outer hip muscles because she's set up for this and she can push against the floor and that knee doesn't collapse all the way in. Okay, what we don't want to see, we wouldn't want to see the feet being in hip width apart because like I said, as you land, you can't stabilize the knees together, twisting side to side. We also don't want to see the feet really wide. We don't want to see it way outside hip width apart because again, the hips can't help out and the knees are more prone to cave in, right? Which is 3 is we obviously don't want to see someone land and then have the knees knocked together. That's not obviously going to be something that's great. That's a really, really high chance of hurting your ACL. Okay. And then obviously we don't want to see the chest being way over one side or way over the other. Okay, so this is just a summary slide, but we don't want to see the left side. We'd like to see the right side. We don't want to see the chest being too upright, right? We also obviously don't want to see it being like pitched over like 90 degrees in a low landing. We don't want to see someone who isn't squatting to parallel, because that's what we call a quad dominant landing. And then we want to see the chest not towards one side, nor do we want to see the feet and the knees really far together, nor the feet really, really wide apart. Okay, what an ideal landing pattern here is a slight forward chest lean, right, which is parallel with the shin angle, those blue lines, 30 degrees of initial impact, which you can't really see here, but then she would slowly descend. After 30 degrees, she would go all the way down to a squat that is just above parallel, right here on this line, okay? And then from the front, what you'd like to see and teach is the chest being equal over both hips. We'd like to see the hips, the knees, and the middle of the foot all in line during that squat. We want to maintain the knees and the feet being that hip width apart. We don't want to see anything rolling in a little bit. I'm just trying to really show the athletes what ideally is going to happen, which is like the squat. Like the squat just needs to show up in terms of a safety point of view, because out of all the things I showed you guys last week and the 2 weeks before, that concept known as its fancier term, but angular displacement, which essentially means your hips and knee joints bend. Like you have to have from an open position to a closed position. That's how muscles work. That's how muscles are active during that process. If it stays open and it's stiff, or if they land like shallow rotated and there's nowhere to bend, those are both really problematic because there's no way for the muscles to help out. It's just like joints, right? So and then on the other issue of parallel to depth, I think the reason this comes up into confusion is where you would imagine the line coming from, right? So in the medical literature, and I didn't want to go into this because of the complexity, right? But when you look at the medical literature, it's the midpoint of the femur up to their butt, the side butt bone, right? And that is in the middle of their hip. And when someone squats to parallel, that's what we're referencing is actually the hip bone, the femur bone, and the ball of the femur is sinking to parallel with the knee, right? And obviously, if you have someone who has really developed hamstrings and has a really developed, glute, for example, they're going to look like they hit the bottom of their thigh, will hit parallel way before their actual leg is fully in parallel. Does that make sense?
So, it does, but that was really fast. So if you can do it one
more.
Yeah,
it's okay. Yeah, maybe I can show this, right? I can demo this with better form. If I squat to parallel, like here, right, I'm at parallel with the bottom of my hamstring in relation to my knee, right? Yeah. So the bottom of my hamstring is at parallel with my knee, but like you can see how like this is my bottom of my hamstring. If I judged it by this, the bottom of my butt muscle is on my knee, so it looks above parallel, right? In the medical literature, it's the middle of the femur bone, which is in the middle of my hip. This bone is right on the outside of my hip. So that has to be able to go all the way down to be in line with my knee. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
So it's quite a bit deeper, right? So say you have an athlete who's very strong, very long, muscular legs, and she lands, she's going to look like she goes slightly below parallel. I would say that itself is probably okay. The hamstring muscle itself and the quad muscle with a 30-degree initial knee bend, there's co-contraction between those two, which protects the ACL. The more you sink into that additional 50 degrees from 30 to 50 from the hip joint, that is continued really, really high activity of the butt muscles, the thigh muscles, the hamstring muscles. If you don't have that extra down to straight parallel, you're probably not going to get the most muscle activity to help. So if I was a judge trying to look at that, I would probably be okay with the hamstring or the bottom of the buttock muscle going slightly below, quote, parallel, right? Because that's going to be in relation of the hip joint to the knee joint, not someone who's really strong and has a larger hamstring that's going down. And I think the angles of research studies are taken from force plates and are taken from sensors that are put on the athlete's joints, right? So it's not around the bottom of the muscle, it's where the joint is in relationship to another joint. That picture that you have up, that 1/10 deduction right there, that is the femur joint, the hip joint, completely parallel to the knee joint. And that would be like where we kind of want to allow an acceptable squat depth to. Anything lower than that, I would say was when you start to get into hot water. Kyla's is a really good example. So see how her hamstring, because she's strong, is below the knee joint, right? It's down here. It's this line to this, but her hip joint in relation to her knee joint is slightly even above parallel, just a little bit. So I would say she probably has she'll sink like a little bit more probably before she comes back up. And obviously this is a 1.5 landing, so it's more exaggerated. But like this to me is like a textbook good example, right? Like she has pretty good squat depth right there. I would say lower, like her hip joint is here. I wish I could draw, but I can't. Her hip joint is here. but her knee joint is right in front. That's like maybe like a hair above parallel, right? Just a hair. And so that for me, I took that on a purpose because she's coming from a 1.5, so it's easier to find that position. But at the same time, if somebody were doing, say, I don't know, a front handspring full as a dismount, right? Or something like that, you would want to see the same position of squat depth to parallel. And I think it comes in more when people are doing half and half outs off bars where they're landing forward, because they're obviously traveling forward gainward, but they're landing up and down. So you would want to see the same, like that side angle in the forward landing, her chest would be more forward. But that is kind of, for me, is like anything past that, I'm like, okay, you just screwed your scale up. You're just under rotated, you know? And I think you do see that, right? So say, I mean, just, it is what it is, right? Someone with different body length or dimensions, if they're really slim and slender, it's going to look like they hit parallel way earlier than someone, or way later, forgive me, than Kyla, who's a very strong athlete. That's kind of her lowest point of the squat right there. And this is an example, right? So that angle that I draw, that green angle, is from her femur joint, her hip joint, her femur, her core. So you can see how it's still slightly a downward angle to her knee, right? It's not completely parallel, but if you were judging that from like her hamstring or where her butt depth is, you would say maybe she's skirting the line of being too deep. To me, a deep landing is someone who is clearly over squatting because they under rotated their skill. I think there's a difference in my mind between lands controlled, squats, comes back up, and arguably lands low to start and goes lower and almost touches their butt on the ground. You know, that's where my mind differentiates it as like a former athlete and a coach. I think in my mind, there's a difference between land control, squat to depth, come back up, and like, you know, under rotate, splat, you squat super deep down.